but also very powerfully some of his very important contributions to our understanding of the world and of how economics, how economies operate. So let me just briefly say that it's true that when we were students we actually read Samir Amin almost, shall we say, in opposition, because we were reading our professors critiquing him, and so we approached it in a particular way. And subsequently as well, our attitude, if I can be very stark, was that, he has a rather simplistic understanding of international relations and so on, because we were these posh young people who thought that, but in fact, it turns out that he had a position which he expressed very clearly and sharply and in some ways almost very dramatically, but it was a relatively subtle position in its details. And it was subtle, I think, precisely because of what Omyoda just said, that he actually captured a particular facet of imperialism that many of us miss out, the imperialism of the mind, the colonialism of the mind in a way, really, the extraordinary and persistent ability that northern structures have of imposing their approach, their perspective and everything on us. So whether it is, whether it is neoliberal economics of a particular kind or bell bottoms, we basically adopt the stuff that is happening in the core. And this in turn changes the way the core operates. So Samir was very much a nationalist, but he was a nationalist because of this deep anti-imperialism. And I think one of the wonderful things about his nationalism was that it was also very internationalist. He kept calling himself a pan-Africanist. The number of times I have heard him say this and emphasize, African solidarity. He was hugely, the institute he founded, the Forum of the Third World, hugely expectant of an association of people across the developing world, and seeing in that the germs of a progressive movement, because he recognized that the struggle against imperialism has to be within nation states as the arena through which citizens can demand their rights and through which all of these relationships play out, all the rules and so on, but also that you can't do this without support in a wider way. So he was, in a very fundamental way, also deeply internationalist. Now, in terms of the approach, he knew about globalization well before it became a kind of concept, as it were. He was always talking about it. His book, Accumulation on a World Scale, right? But he was always aware of the global trajectories, the global patterns, and he then sought to see how those global patterns actually play out within particular national trajectories. And throughout this also, he was very conscious of the role of monopolies. Now, you find suddenly that people are waking up to these monopolies in the mainstream world as well. They're saying, oh my goodness, there are monopolies of technology, and Google controls this, and somebody else controls that. There are monopolies in armaments, something that Samir had written about well before. There are monopolies in trade. Again, these are all, shall we say, recent discoveries of the mainstream, which were things that he had been talking about for several decades. There are monopolies, of course, over capital, but there are, as he calls it, the critical thing about the monopolies of weapons of mass destruction became a very significant issue during things like the Iraq War and so on, where precisely that terminology was used, inverted, so to speak, to make very, very different political arguments. And of course, Samir therefore said that the way to combat imperialism is delinking. Many people call this utopian, many people say it can't happen, and so on. It's a very interesting world we live in, and I think it's a shame that we have lost Samir now, because he would have been quite intrigued to find a world in which the core is trying to delink. And, the possibilities that opens up, in a way. Of course, the core is trying to delink in the most aggressive and exploitative way possible, but the fact that it opens up possibilities. He welcomed multipolarity, for example, although he recognized that there are all kinds of issues there as well, and there are different kinds of exploitative relations that may emerge even with other poles. All of these things he recognized. But I think what I'm trying to get across is the fact that many of the things he said have a tremendous resonance today. they have a tremendous validity, resonance, and a lot of the things that he talked about, Professor Bagchi's article is an excellent indication of that, are things which we can still use to understand global tendencies and tendencies in our own economies. Finally, I just want to say, it's true, he was this very impressive person. He was also, he was a person of immense charm. He was utterly charming. I don't know how else to put it. He could just win you over completely. And it was not only because he had that, how to put it, that very civilized, Frenchified kind of way of speaking and so on, but also because he was like a child in his enthusiasm and his commitment and his passion. So he could get really worked up. And I don't know whether Omiyota has had, yes, I'm sure, because he's another one like that. But he could get totally worked up about issues and, be extremely sort of agitated and so on. But there was always so much involvement, so much, yes, like a child, he would be really, really engaged and he would be so committed. He was ill, he had been ill for a very long time, and he was sending emails maybe 3 times a week about his new plan, the new international, yes? Why aren't you responding? Why aren't you organizing this? We have to do this at once. Next month I want you to do the following things. He was doing this maybe till 3 weeks before we got the news, or at least for me, I'm sure, maybe, yeah. And it just tells you something about this man who was extraordinarily wise, and of course you expect an old man to be wise, but extraordinarily young in many ways. And I think if we can keep some of that passion, and we can somehow get you guys to see how that passion is just so utterly, utterly exciting and charming and attractive, then maybe there's still hope in the world. Thank you.